thank all of you for coming. I'm Josh Buckley. I'm an associate professor here at the LBJ School, and I just have the honor. I'm also a Brumley Fellow mentor, and we have two of our fellows, Julian and Kasuke, who are going to introduce the speaker today. Fantastic topic. I know Patrick for more than a decade, and it's a tremendous opportunity for us to have him here today. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to them to make the formal introduction. So, go ahead.
So my name is Jillian Ames. I'm a second-year master's student in the Department of Drag Queen and Environment.
I'm second-year PhD from development for management and physical.
Yep, we're both working with Dr. Buckley. So without further ado, Patrick Meier is currently the Director of Social Innovation at the Qatar Computing Research Institute, where he works with experts in advanced computing to develop new generation humanitarian technologies, helping to revolutionize the power and effectiveness of relief efforts worldwide. During major disasters, he deploys these innovative solutions at the request of international humanitarian organizations, including the UN and the World Health Organization. Patrick serves as the innovation team of the UN Secretary General's World Humanitarian Summit and co-founded the Digital Humanitarian Network with the UN, which has been described as one of the most innovative humanitarian initiatives in the past 10 years. Patrick also co-founded the International Crisis Mappers Network and the award-winning Standby Task Force, both early and notable pioneers of the digital humanitarian action. He received his PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in International Affairs with a focus on digital activism and crisis mapping with a pre-doctoral fellowship from Stanford University. Patrick's work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, BBC News, NPR, Nature, and Scientific American, just to name a few. Patrick is also an internationally sought-out speaker, having given over 200 talks in more than 20 countries across the 6 continents. So we are truly fortunate to have Patrick with us today, and let's give a warm welcome to him.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks so much for the very kind introduction, and thanks again, Josh and team, for the kind invitation to be here. We've been trying to make this happen, and it's finally happened, so it's been a real treat. I really enjoyed the conversations we've just had with the fellows as well. Some really very exciting research and cross-disciplinary research happening here. So I'm hoping that this can be the excuse to catalyze some collaboration, some joint research between some of the work that I've been doing and colleagues that I've been interacting with, and some of the faculty and students here as well. So just hopefully the start and not just a one-off. So I've been invited to share some of the work I've been doing over the past couple of years and to focus more specifically on the recent stuff, because I think that's usually the more interesting. So I'll jump right in and just set the scene. Humanitarian organizations have basically evolved out of a world that's described by this picture here on top. A world that's marked by information scarcity, barren information landscapes, which mean that when disasters happen, we would know who had been affected, how badly, and where for weeks, if at all. Increasingly, however, humanitarian organizations are finding themselves in a drastically different world. I call this climate change, but a change in the data climate more than anything else. We've gone to information scarcity, from information scarcity to massive information overflow. Now, that's not to say that we don't have any more information deserts. There are still plenty of them, but they are shrinking. And this is very much a one-way street as far as this data climate change goes. We're definitely going to this big data environment where this total information overload, this data that gets generated during disasters is becoming as paralyzing to humanitarian efforts as the absence of information. So humanitarian organizations are in fact no better off in this world. First of all, they're completely unprepared to manage this world. But both of these scenarios present very notable challenges to humanitarian organizations. Now, how do we start adapting to this world of total information overload? Well, one way to describe the problem is, how do we find those proverbial needles in the haystack? And by that I mean those pieces of information that get generated during disasters that actually lead to situational awareness, that actually help inform decision making, that are actually actionable. And the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of data, specifically user-generated content that does get generated during disasters, from tweets, pictures, Instagram, Facebook updates, YouTube videos, you name it, vast majority of them are actually not directly relevant to disaster efforts. They're not actionable. Sometimes they don't have geographic information, and they don't really add to situational awareness. So we really are looking for the small fraction of information that does actually potentially even make a difference, a life and death difference, because it's actionable, it's located, and people can actually respond to it. It's a challenge, however, and it's becoming more and more of a challenge to look for and find these needles in a haystack. We're dealing with more social media platforms than ever before, and a diversity of data types as well. We're not just trying to figure out how to make sense of text in tweets or in SMSs. We're also having to make sense of multimedia content that gets generated. Pictures, again, on Instagram or Flickr or wherever, and YouTube videos and more. How do we take all this information and make sense of it when we're talking about hundreds of thousands of pictures in a day, hundreds of thousands of videos in a week, millions of tweets, millions of Facebook updates? It's just this torrent of big data. Now, one way to go about making sense of this information is to basically get all our good friends and rush that haystack together and look for those needles. You know, this is a crowdsourcing idea that's been really now done for 5 years, if we look at the Haiti earthquake as being the milestone. This is fun for the first 5 minutes, but it's possibly the most least efficient way to go about making sense of big data. And frankly, we can't win the big data battle just with crowdsourcing alone. That's become very apparent already 5 years ago in the response to the tragic Haiti earthquake in January 2010. And the fact of the matter is it's not scalable for other reasons as well. We're not just dealing with one stack of information that pops up during a disaster, that explodes during a disaster. We're in fact dealing with multiple stacks of information, and unless we have 1 million volunteers, which we can get to, but would that be the best use of human time as well? 1 million hours going into this, human hours. And the fact of the matter is it's even worse than this particular situation. We're not dealing with nicely packaged stacks of information that we can just, calmly go through. We're dealing with largely unstructured information that basically stretches from horizon to horizon. And if you go back to the original term or saying a needle in a haystack is from St. Thomas More in the 16th century, where he writes, in fact, the original Latin, he writes about an issue being as hard as looking for a needle in a meadow. That's a correct translation. And it's far more apropos to this big data challenge that we face in the humanitarian space. So what are we going to do about this? Big data is not going away. Humanitarian organizations are not data scientists, are not computer scientists. There's a mismatch in terms of skills here and challenges. Well, for one, crowdsourcing, we don't have to throw that out the window entirely. Crowdsourcing is very much still part of the solution, but only part of the solution. If we want crowdsourcing to really be able to scale, then we want to start looking at adding a little artificial intelligence, a little AI, which may sound like science fiction, but the fact is the United Nations has been making use of artificial intelligence for the past couple of years to make sense of big crisis data during disasters. And what I want to do is share some concrete examples of all this in action and take a very recent major disaster, the earthquakes in Nepal in April and May of this year. Now, unlike 5 years ago during the Haiti earthquake, which was all reactive and we were making it up as we went along, what we had in 2015 was the Digital Humanitarian Network, which is a network I co-founded with the UN a few years back, which brings together a number of different volunteer groups, or volunteer and technical communities, as we've called them as well, from all around the world that all kind of specialize in different areas of this information management workflow. And this network has really now become the official interface between established humanitarian organizations, which I call dinosaur bureaucratic organizations, and these very tech-savvy, distributed, very agile volunteer groups that occupy every time zone on the planet. But perhaps they are, in fact, the superheroes of digital humanitarian action, because they do have, in a way, these different superpowers where one member, for example, is Humanitarian OpenStreetMap, that specializes in analyzing satellite imagery very quickly and very effectively. You've got the Standby Task Force that really specializes in social media content, and then you have many others, from GIS Corps to Translators Without Borders. But perhaps the main difference between the Avengers and the digital humanitarian movement is that the digital humanitarian movement is largely run by women. And this has been true ever since Haiti. In Haiti and since Haiti, the vast majority of digital humanitarian volunteers are women. So it's very much a women's-driven movement. Now, what happened when the earthquake struck? Well, within a few hours, the UN activated the digital humanitarian network with a number of asks. One ask was, please find all the tweets being generated in Nepal that refer to urgent needs. A second ask was, look at all the pictures being posted on social media and also in mainstream media, and identify which of these pictures show damage, show infrastructure damage, and then let us know where these pictures were taken, because otherwise, how are we going to respond to it, and how are we going to assess disaster damage? And again, unlike 5 years ago, and there's been a lot of comparisons being made, that's why I go back to Haiti a lot, over the past, since the Nepal earthquake, just showing how far the digital humanitarian space has come. We didn't have this in Haiti, but now we do. Micromappers basically uses what I call smart crowdsourcing, which is microtasking. And it combines microtasking, also known as human computing for computer scientists, with artificial intelligence to make sense of different types of data piles, from text-based information to photos, videos, and imagery as well. So within hours of this request that we received from the UN, we were able to deploy micromappers and invite hundreds of digital volunteers from all around the world to help us make sense of tweets and pictures. So if you were volunteering as a digital Jedi, as the UN calls digital humanitarians, if you were a digital Jedi and volunteering your time in the aftermath of the major earthquake in Nepal, this is what you would see online. This is literally a screenshot. And these information needs here come directly from the UN. We didn't make those up. These were the information gaps that our UN partners had and wanted more information on. And it's as easy as this. We would automatically collect the tweets, push them to micromappers, and invite volunteers to classify or categorize the tweets. Simple as that. Single-click activism actually works, actually makes a difference operationally in humanitarian efforts. Now, of course, think back to the rushing the pile, the haystack. Fun for the first 5 minutes, probably not for 5 hours, right? Which is why we have AIDR, A-I-D-R, stands for Artificial Intelligence for Disaster Response. Like Micromappers, is a free and open source platform, which I'm frankly surprised more students and academics don't make more use of. But what AIDR does is the smart machine learning engine that sits behind Micromappers. And so if you think about these categories as being buckets, you've got these digital Jedis from all around the world who are basically adding tweets to these different buckets based on whether they refer to urgent need or population displacement or disaster damage. And what AIDR does is it looks at each of these buckets and it starts to recognize patterns. It says, okay, I'm looking at this bucket of urgent tweets. I see 72 tweets. I'm starting to see a pattern that seems to have all these tweets share a similar pattern. And what it does is it uses a technique from artificial intelligence called statistical machine learning to recognize that pattern. And once these buckets are full enough, and we can talk about what that means during the Q&A, AIDR can automatically go out and tag up to 2 million tweets an hour. Any future tweets that come in, it'll automatically tag them and put them in the buckets so that the crowd doesn't have to spend 100 or 200 or 1,000 hours doing this manually. This is how we win the big data battle. It's this combination of hybrid human computing and machine computing. Now, of course, most people are not on social media around the world, at least not yet. So what we've also done is we've partnered with Unicef to modify the platform. Same principle, though, in terms of automatic classification of text. In this case, though, it's SMS. So Unicef piloted this very successfully earlier this year. And now we've got the World Food Program and the International Federation of the Red Cross that are all looking to pilot this over the next couple months as well. They've got a number of different SMS programs and projects where they're receiving tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of text messages. How are they going to make sense of this information if you don't actually use machine learning and AI? I mentioned pictures as well. So if you were a digital Jedi, and I hope you will be in the future, this is what you'd see with micromappers. We would automatically collect pictures posted on platforms like Twitter, as well as the mainstream media, and push one at a time to this particular interface. And again, it's as simple as single click. What level of damage do you see in each of these? And by the way, it doesn't go this fast. You don't have to worry. That's stressful, right? But once you click, the next picture comes up. And what we've done, just like with tweets, by the way, is we've shown every picture or every tweet to like 3 or 5 different volunteers. And only if there's consensus, in a way you can think of these as votes, right? If this picture gets 5 votes, and these 5 votes all say that it's severe damage, then we lend a little more trust to that particular vote. And we say, okay, we're going to trust that it is severe damage. Again, we could do this maybe a little longer than the tweets. Pictures are perhaps less tedious to look at, but ultimately it's going to get old pretty quickly, which is why we've been working with some computer vision students to see if we can start teaching our algorithms to recognize whether at least a picture shows a house, a building, a shelter of sorts, so that we can actually filter all the others. Because again, the vast majority is noise. It's actually not relevant. So why spend 100 volunteers' time looking at pictures that are irrelevant, right? It's no point. So while this might sound so maybe like science fiction, industry's already done this. Amazon already uses this. They're very effective at doing automated feature detection in pictures and videos as well. Now what do we do with all these filtered content? We add it to a map, not because we think maps are pretty, but because if we can map it, that information is actionable. Right? Showing a picture of a damaged bridge in Kathmandu to the UN is pointless. Where in Kathmandu? Right? It does not become actionable until you have some kind of location information. And it doesn't have to be within a few meters precision, but just in a general area is usually good enough. One thing to note with these crowdsourced maps is that they're not just dots on a map, right? What I see when I look at these maps, and have been seeing since the Haiti earthquake, is all the volunteers that have mobilized online to make this map possible. These dots didn't just appear out of thin air. And in the case of the response to Nepal, we had 3,000 digital Jedis in some 90 countries around the world that came together, mobilized online to help the UN's relief efforts, to help others in need, folks who they would never meet, right? But they had the option, they had the initiative, they cared. So the digital humanitarian story, as I hope I make very clear in my new book, is as much a story about humanity than it is about technology. It's about, in a way, having the technology help extend our humanity. We're no longer bound by borders and distance and so on. Somebody in Argentina or in Finland can get online and actually have an impact by supporting these relief efforts. Keep in mind that we don't just deploy micromappers because we feel like it. It always comes through an application. The UN, the World Bank, and so on have to apply. They have to convince us that if we do deliver this data, it is actually going to be useful, is going to be used, is useful, and is going to make a difference in terms of decision making. So together, these digital Jedis clocked some 300,000 clicks on micromappers in just a matter of days. Those are the sort of terrestrial sensors, right? In terms of, if we think about these as sensors, people taking pictures and so on, tweeting from what they're observing from the ground. How about aerial sensors? UAVs, civilian drones, I prefer the word UAVs and so on, are starting to get more and more democratized. It's incredible how quickly this technology is spreading around the world and how the costs are plummeting as well. And what these UAVs are, they are aerial robots. This is a field of robotics because they're autonomous. You can program them to fly certain patterns and collect information. And you see from the latest statistics and industry numbers that just this year alone, at the end of this year, we'll have over 4 million of these consumer civilian UAVs, small UAVs being sold across the world. And you talk to industry experts and they're telling you this is just the beginning. It's going very, very fast. And one way to see the result of that is if you go to the Travel by Drones website, which is a fun website where thousands and thousands of people with UAVs have uploaded their aerial videos and aerial pictures, and some of them are absolutely stunning. I mean, like really Hollywood quality, just incredible. Not only in the US and in Europe as well. And so you're starting to see that potentially aerial data can potentially become also a big data challenge as well. Now, of course, UAVs are not everywhere right now, and they may not ever be everywhere at some point in the future either. It's unevenly distributed as technology distribution goes. So in a place like Guyana, you're not seeing much traffic. You're not seeing much data coming out. But let's look a little closer in the forests, beautiful forests of rainforest of Guyana, where a local indigenous community, the Wapichanas, have been building their own fixed-wing UAV with a little help from some friends of mine at Digital Democracy. So there you have it. Maybe not visible right now, but this technology is going directly to places like the Amazon, to the Namibian deserts, and other places where you would not necessarily expect to find them. This is a video of their very first flight. See if there's
I think we can almost just let go.
Nobody said innovation was easy, right? But if at first you don't succeed. So there you have it, an indigenous community using their own UAVs to document illegal deforestation and illegal mining in Guyana. It's an incredible story, and I think it's a powerful story because it's going to show you we're not just talking about these massive, super expensive, super sophisticated UAVs. If indigenous communities in Guyana can build these, and we've seen in Ghana as well, where students are building quadcopters out of recycled materials and so on, it's becoming a real new movement around robotics and hacking robotics, and some kind of the Maker Faire movement as well. So I got interested in this technology and have been blogging about it since 2007 in terms of humanitarian applications, but it wasn't until the Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. I was seconded to the UN in the Philippines, and within a week of being in Manila, I'd come across half a dozen UAV teams. I mean, that's completely unprecedented. We'd never seen, really, frankly, any UAVs being used in disaster response. Maybe one team, and it would be a large, more military-grade UAV. But here we had about 5 teams that came out with small UAVs and were doing all kinds of mapping. But it also became very clear that most of them were not talking to each other. Most of them were not sharing any imagery between themselves, let alone with local authorities or local communities. And this got me kind of concerned. So I went online and looked up, Googled disaster response, UAVs, code of conduct. There was nothing. This was November 2013, and I was a little alarmed by that because there was nothing I could then share with these UAV teams and say, by the way, there are some guidelines here you might want to follow. So I figured, okay, well then I'll do it. Not that I know how to write guidelines. The first draft was a disaster. But I launched after leaving the Philippines, shortly after leaving the Philippines, launched this humanitarian UAV network, or UAVators, to promote, to enable the safe, responsible, and effective use of this technology in both humanitarian and development settings. And as part of this, having been inspired by the Travel by Drones website, my team and I launched this crowdsourced crisis map of aerial pictures and aerial videos of disaster zones from all around the world. Some 600 plus pictures and videos, including dozens and dozens from post-earthquake Nepal. Now, what's really interesting from having collected and seen all these videos and pictures being posted is that they're all posted on YouTube or on Flickr or online. I now talk about aerial data, this kind of aerial data, as aerial social media. It is user-generated content. It's a different kind of sensor. It's an aerial sensor, but it's still people going out and trying to capture data and sharing it through social media channels. So this is in part to try and see if we can create increased situational awareness during disasters. As more and more eyewitnesses have UAVs for entertainment purposes, for hobbyist purposes, also for commercial and professional purposes, we're going to have eyewitnesses who are not only bearing witness from the ground, bound by the laws of gravity as to what's happening before them, but also from the air, giving a bird's eye view. So this could potentially become also a really important repository of aerial data for computer vision research as well, because we're going to need to be able to do automated feature detection in aerial videos as well. So we've been working and collaborating and connected directly with all these humanitarian organizations. And the reason I'm sharing this here is to tell you that every single one of these groups is already starting to explore the use of UAVs. It is not a hypothetical, it's not science fiction. In fact, the majority of these are already starting to test UAVs. And the rate of adoption of this new technology is mind-blowing. The rate of adoption of this new technology is mind-blowing. I've not seen anything like this in the humanitarian space. We completely missed the boat on mobile technology in the 1990s and the early 2000s, completely missed out. Just did not think about SMS, did not think about using mobile technology at all. This is mind-blowing. I didn't think we'd be here until 2018, 2019, and yet there's a lot of action happening. Which is why the Humanitarian UAV Network exists in part, is to help catalyze information sharing and collaboration between the UAV industry, the UAV experts, as well as humanitarian organizations, and make sure that a conversation is happening, that both communities are learning from each other and collaborating. And as part of the Humanitarian UAV Network, I've had the privilege of spearheading and coordinating humanitarian UAV missions, such as after Cyclone Pam, which was a Category 5 cyclone in March of this year, just before the earthquake in Nepal, which devastated the islands of Vanuatu. So the World Bank activated the Humanitarian UAV Network, and we have a roster, a dedicated roster of UAV pilots, 400 pilots in about 50 countries around the world. And so when they activated the network and said, we need aerial surveys of the disaster-affected areas, within a few hours, I had identified 2 teams who were ready to mobilize and join this humanitarian effort. Our task was to carry out field-based surveys. Was to complement field-based surveys. We were doing the aerial-based surveys, but what the World Bank and the government of Vanuatu were doing what often happens, if not always happens, in disasters. You do field-based disaster damage assessments. Not always paper anymore, but tablets or smartphones, but going to these different houses, shelters, and documenting for every building, shelter, house, the level of damage. This can be really time-consuming. It's also fraught with serious data quality issues, and frankly, in the case of Vanuatu, we had to throw away 30% of the surveys. They were not complete enough to actually be used. And you don't always see around the house, or if it's a multi-story house, you don't really know if it's damaged on the 2nd floor or the 3rd floor. And that's where we came in, not to replace the field-based surveys, but to complement and to help triangulate the data from the field-based surveys with the aerial data. So we primarily used multi-rotor UAVs, these hexacopters, for example, worked very closely with the government, in direct partnership with the government. They gave us the priority areas to survey with the UAVs. We worked directly with the Australian Defence Force and air traffic control, because we were operating in a complex airspace where you literally had C-130s landing and taking off with relief supplies. So it was not a segregated airspace, and we had to obviously keep safety as the #1 priority, but it worked incredibly well. And unfortunately, that's the exception rather than the rule, where you have phenomenal civil-military coordination with also air traffic control playing a pivotal role. Now, I mentioned that UAVs are aerial robots, and that's very, very true. So between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., if not 3 a.m., after our flight plans were approved by the air traffic control and Australian Defence Force, we would program all the flights for the following day to basically go out and fly. But the purpose of this was not just to go out and fly, right, or to collect pretty pictures. Humanitarians don't want more pictures. They want answers to their questions. They want to know where the houses that are fully destroyed are actually located, where the houses that are largely intact located. They don't want 1,000 pictures. And here we're going to revisit our good old friend, big data. There was recent research done by Texas A&M University that showed that a single 20-minute UAV flight can collect about 800 pictures. And a trained imagery analyst will need at least a minute per high-resolution aerial image to analyze that image. So you're talking about a 20-minute UAV flight generating 13 hours worth of work. And we had 60 flights over the course of 2.5 weeks. So you can imagine we're running into a big data challenge very quickly. And that indeed did happen, because after 4 or 5 days of this, we would, at the end of every day, go to the government office and hand over the hard disks or the flash disks, the SD cards, where we had collected all the imagery. And we found out pretty quickly that actually the GIS team was not even looking at this imagery. They were completely overwhelmed with other data that was coming in, and they had no time to integrate this data source into their own GIS analysis. It was a complete disconnect, which was ironic. Here we were contracted by the World Bank to carry out these aerial surveys and provide the data so that they could complement the field-based surveys. And frankly, those flash disks and SD cards would have just stayed there for a week or longer without even being used. So this is where the digital humanitarians came in. The World Bank, at my suggestion, they hadn't really heard about the Digital Humanitarian Network, said, please apply to activate the Digital Humanitarian Network and we'll get this done. So we partnered with the outstanding Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team who got to work right away. The blue traces are intact houses, yellow, partially damaged, red, fully destroyed. And they did an outstanding job. It wasn't crowdsourced. They just got a small team to do this and do this really well. And that helped get some of the load off, the burden off the GIS team in Vanuatu. In addition to the nadir imagery, what nadir simply refers to bird's eye view, like looking straight down, as we're familiar with satellite imagery. We also collected oblique imagery, and that's because oblique images can provide a lot more useful information for disaster damage assessment. So this is one of the images I took with my UAV in Vanuatu. You can see more of the walls and so on. And there's only 2 scientific papers I know of that have been published, peer-reviewed, that show and provide evidence that yes, oblique imagery is more useful than nadir imagery. But it doesn't have to be an either or. They're quite complementary. So what we ended up doing was taking these oblique images, which again the World Bank had 0 time to look at, slice them up into micro images and push them to micromappers, which we had modified to crowdsource the analysis of oblique aerial imagery. OpenStreetMap cannot deal with oblique images. They can only deal with orthorectified 2D nadir imagery. And so that's why we had to go with micromappers. And it was the same deal. We invited volunteers to simply trace houses and annotate whether it was fully destroyed and so on. And it worked really well within a few days. Digital Jedis had analyzed some 6,000 plus aerial images. And if you go to the map, which is I believe still on micromappers.org, you'll see some of the results here as well. Blue, again, is largely intact. And we're not talking about satellite imagery, right? And this is already pretty high resolution. But check this out. I mean, we were talking about 4 centimeter on average resolution and oblique, being able to then do this kind of disaster damage assessments. And so we shared all this within a few days with our World Bank colleagues in the government. This is just another output here. And the reason you see multiple traces is because we were showing each image to multiple volunteers, again, for consensus and so on. We then teamed up with some computer vision students in Lausanne, Switzerland. They took all these traces and started developing machine learning classifiers, teaching our algorithms to recognize whether an oblique image includes a house or a shelter. And we've gotten pretty good at this. What's also possible, I'm almost over time, so I'm going to wrap up in a couple minutes. What's also possible now with UAVs is we don't have to wait for the UAV to land. In Vanuatu, we did. The UAV assets we had meant that we had to wait 30 minutes, 40 minutes of flying time, right? Autonomous flight, twiddle, 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 boring. And then finally the UAV lands, comes back home, we take the SD card, and then we start analyzing. What's possible now is we can get this imagery broadcast back to our laptops right away, to the base station right away. Either live video footage or live pictures, which, you know, why not if we can have it live, wait 30 minutes, especially for search and rescue. So what we've done is we've partnered with a computer science department at the University of Southampton. We had taken dozens and dozens of aerial videos of Vanuatu. This is one of them. And we modified micromappers to enable volunteers to crowdsource the analysis of live aerial video footage. And what you see here is every dot is somebody clicking with a mouse on the video footage simultaneously, right? We have hundreds of volunteers. And the places that get lit up are where 80% of volunteers are clicking in the same area. We provide that real-time feedback loop, real-time kind of, well, latency of a second or two, heat map to provide that kind of information to the pilot if they want to change the flight plan and to humanitarian organizations. And we're taking the results of that and seeing whether we can develop machine learning classifiers as well from this kind of work. And it's not just an academic exercise. The fact is that Vanuatu, if you go to the World Bank's list of disaster-prone countries, the World Risk Index, Vanuatu is number 1. Number 1 most disaster-prone country in the world. And with the El Nino effect being the strongest next year that it has been in about 50 years, we're expecting that there's going to be more bad news headed to Vanuatu in the next 3 to 6 months. So this is a race against time in some respects. If we want to get these algorithms to be robust enough so that we can apply them to future humanitarian UAV missions. All right, yikes. Can I have another 5 minutes? Okay. I wanted to end with Nepal quickly. This is a picture I took last month, not in April after the earthquake. I spearheaded a UAV mission, more of a disaster recovery UAV mission in Nepal in partnership with Kathmandu University, Kathmandu Living Labs, DJI, and a Pix4D as well. And it was a two-pronged mission. The first mission was to train students on how to use UAVs, how to actually fly quadcopters, and that's where our partners DJI came in, trained some 30 students at the engineering department at Kathmandu University, along with faculty and along with local and international representatives of NGOs like Engineers Without Borders took part in the course. And we even had time to train some mini-monks who loved this stuff, couldn't get enough. They were supposed to be playing football at the pitch over there, but none of them, all 40 of them, just rushed the basketball court and wanted to learn more about this technology. So not only did we spend time transferring the skills and the knowledge on how to use the technology, but thanks to our technology partners, we were able to donate 10 of these Phantoms and also free licenses for software imagery analysis. And that's really important to me, but also very core to the mission of the Humanitarian UAV Network, is to directly empower local communities, local partners to use this technology themselves, not only for disaster response, but disaster preparedness and agriculture, farming, and so on. The second part of our mission was really more of less of a training, but an actual UAV mission. We were invited to survey one of the hardest hit areas of Nepal after the earthquake, a town called Panga, which we really got very attached to. I don't have time now to give you a whole spiel on this mission, but I'm going to give you highlights and invite you to read the mission summary on my blog at iRevolutions. So we were invited by the Community Disaster Management Committee of Kirtipur, this particular ward. They were really in need of high-resolution aerial imagery to help inform their rebuilding efforts, their road clearance, their rubble clearance, as well as future disaster preparedness efforts. So this whole mission was carried out in direct partnership, equal partnership with the local community. They were the ones who informed the flight plans. They were the ones who told us where to program the UAV flights to go and what altitude to fly, where to take off from, and where to land, and so on. And after we were finished with doing these aerial surveys and we were on our way back to the van to pack up and go back to Kathmandu University, the lead representative of the local community kind of came up to us somewhat nervous and said, "You are coming back tomorrow, right?" And in fact, we weren't planning. We had only allocated a certain amount of time to do these aerial surveys. We were on the clock. Time was ticking. We had to get back to Kathmandu University. And he basically said, "Listen, you've only done 30% of the town. There's 70% missing. We need the rest to do our work." So this really threw a wrench in our plans, but it was the best kind of wrench, right? That's when you know you're doing something useful. Not only have you been invited to do the survey, but your partners tell you haven't finished and you need to come back. So we had to adjust, and I canceled my return flight and stayed on a few extra days, and we spent the next day literally from sun up to sundown without taking a break for lunch, just mapping. So a good 30, 40 flights, different altitudes for different reasons, across the town of Panga, which results in this. When you use the Pix4D software, you stitch all these images together, because what these UAVs do is they'll take a picture, and they'll turn around and take pictures and do this, right? And so you need the software to stitch all this together. And again, we're not talking anymore about lowish resolution satellite imagery, but very high resolution aerial imagery as well. And you compare this to what our partners were working off. They were working off Bing maps, Bing imagery, and satellite imagery. So not only like completely out of focus, but frankly also out of date as well. And because of all the flights we did and the UAVs we had and so on, what you can also do with aerial imagery is reconstruct 3D models from the 2D images. And this is all orthorectified, which means that there's a GPS coordinate for everything you see here, which again is important for that actionable part of disaster damage assessments, rebuilding, and so on. And it is high resolution. And you're not limited to static, but you can fly around, walk through the town of Panga now, and assess disaster damage and the rebuilding process and where the piles of rubble are across the town of Panga. Disaster damage, after all, is a 3D phenomenon. It's not a 2D phenomenon. So we want to be able to work in 3D. And in fact, what we want to do next, you might guess it, is bring that into micromappers and crowdsource the analysis of 3D models. This is downtown Kathmandu, Durnban Square. After the earthquake, we want to crowdsource the analysis and annotation of 3D models. It's a lot more intuitive to work in 3D than 2D. That's why you actually need training to do 2D imagery interpretation, because you lose a lot of information and you have to actually get trained on how to do that. But all of us here are very familiar with 3D because we're born in a 3D world, right? We understand what 3D looks like. And now the next step, and I don't know if any of you can help me out with the next step here, and this is potentially a bit more science fiction, but I think the technology is there, is we want to take this 3D models and go right to virtual reality. Right? Instead of having our 3,000 digital volunteers go online and 2D trace on micromappers, why don't they put their Google Cardboard, costs nothing, adds their smartphone to the Google Cardboard glass thing, and start walking down, 3,000 people walking down Kathmandu doing disaster damage assessment. Now, what we can do is, with Oculus and so on, we can already do the visualization. What I need help on is how to annotate a virtual reality model. I mean, this is not just being a disaster tourist, right? It's actually adding information. So I want our digital Jedis to be able to actually annotate in 3D. So anyway, park that for now, and I'll end with this last little anecdote. Clearly, our local partners don't have Oculus Rift, and frankly, they also don't have access to laptops or tablets for that matter. So I was adamant that we not leave Nepal until we did something about this, to liberate this data, to unlock this data. So I ended up making good friends with somebody who worked at a coffee shop, and he told me about a banner shop nearby. And so what we ended up doing was taking the imagery, printing them on large banners, rollable, waterproof banners. And waterproof because rains and so on, and banners because we don't want paper to rip, right? We wanted something durable to share with the local community. So then we engaged in what's called public participatory GIS, or community mapping, with the local community, who had seen us fly nonstop, zzz, make a shitload of noise, kind of annoying, but they could really see the result of it in a very tangible way. So we worked with the CDMC, the Community Disaster Management Group, and we identified, they told us what features they wanted to add to the map, to annotate to the map. And that's what we invited the local community to do. We got a bunch of different colored pieces of paper, some scissors, and a lot of tape, and invited the community to take ownership over this process, to add their local knowledge. In fact, we, in a way, crowdsourcing the community's local knowledge and help them take ownership and annotate the map directly, enabling them to add their own social intelligence layer on top of this base map, which has been produced by rather sophisticated aerorobotics technology. But you could bring it right back to the solid world, to the real world, where it really mattered to the local community members. And it was tremendous for over 4 hours. In fact, we left and they were still doing this. Local community members came around, students and so on, and it enabled a more of a democratic approach. It's not usually what you see, right? If you're behind a laptop, you've got a bunch of men looking over and the men have the discussion, right? And here we made it open. We went deliberately to the center square of the local community in Panga and put all the maps out there and engaged everybody in the community. And it was phenomenal. I mean, I don't speak the local language, but I was getting some translation. They were discussing on priorities for the rebuilding, on which houses were damaged and non-inhabited because they were too dangerous, on how to, what rubble areas were a big problem for road clearance and so on. So it was a tremendous energy that this kind of elicited. And this is and then we left, and they were still conversations. It was really, really incredible. So that's my story. In closing, it's not about one information stack. It's about using crowdsourcing and artificial intelligence to make sense of all these different data types and bring it all together somehow. And this is maybe another area where you might be able to help, is how do we take all these different data sets, different temporal scales, spatial scales, resolutions, and so on, and make sense of it. It can be very powerful to overlay pictures on top of aerial imagery. It can be cross-referencing, cross-triangulation, verification, and so on. And as far as I know, I only need 2 scientific peer-reviewed papers that actually go and look at this idea of satellite imagery with tweets, with pictures, with aerial imagery, and so on. And they've shown, the results show that it helps to add contextual analysis. So thank you for your patience. That's it. Thank you.
I'm going to jump in, just kind of take the privilege to say that we had a lot of presentations in here from a range of very impressive people. This is one of the neatest things I've seen, and I just want to congratulate you.
Thank you for having me.
People that I know you stand on the shoulders of and doing this. I think it's really special.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much.
I know there are lots of questions.
Do I just field them, or?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you for this talk. It's really fascinating. My question is about humanitarian crises with a political dimension. So, so I'm thinking specifically of refugee crises in the Middle East, but also recently the earthquake that hit Pakistan and Afghanistan. A lot of information. It's really hard to find information because of the political situation in both those countries. So what sort of tweaks could you make to this model that would sort of allow for some of the considerations that we see in these more politically inflected humanitarian crises?
That's a really good question. I mean, what was interesting is in 2011, the UN asked us to create a crisis map of Libya during the early February, March of 2011 when the conflict was escalating. And one of the reasons they did that was because they didn't have their own personnel on the ground in Libya yet. But they wanted an initial understanding as to what's going on. And obviously they couldn't trust the state media as well. But we found plenty of information on social media, and we had many Arabic-speaking volunteers who got online and helped us filter all that information. So we were able to create a rather populated, dense crisis map of health issues, security issues, shelter issues, you name it, across Libya from initially predominantly from social media, and then mainstream media. When Western media got there as well, we were able to leverage it a little more. But what do you do when somebody pulls a plug as well in cell phone towers, like with Mubarak in Egypt, and it goes dark? Then you've got a kind of an information desert there. What we saw there was some interesting uses of what's called meshed mobile communication, which is quite disruptive because what it does is it allows you to communicate with mobile phones without having to go through a cell phone tower. It's like daisy chain. So you probably Google it. And it's disruptive because then why do you need an AT&T, right? If you can just piggyback on mobile phones. It's more challenging than that, but it's quite promising. And I know of some Egyptian activists who used that to communicate during that time. So it is a challenge. There are still these information deserts, whether they're man-made or not, and we have to find ways to get around them. But the good news is I think they're getting smaller, not bigger.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, please, please.
I guess I'm thinking about this from the end of being actionable, right? So to activate the digital humanitarian network, to activate the
Yeah.
leaders, you have to sort of indicate that there's an actionable, that it's an actionable use of the data.
Yeah.
But in a lot of these politically tense, fraught situations, how do you prove that you could use the data?
I mean, it's hard to prove that it'll be useful and actionable, but what we do is we do put the burden of proof on the humanitarian organizations. They have to make a compelling case that this is a gap, that they need this information, and that they will use this information. It doesn't always work out, even if we do approve the application, right? And sometimes, but we want more than speculative. We actually want core arguments and how this data is going to be fed, how is it going to inform decision making, and so on. But that's the theory. The practice is a lot more messy. Sure. Did we have that one and then there? Yeah.
Well, I have one question about the ethical challenge in
Yeah.
this case, because in case of Libya, the dictatorship may use these kind of big data, and they may kind of utilize this data for maybe repression process. So
Absolutely.
maybe it's kind of how can you clear these kind of ethical challenges?
Thank you for asking that. Really important question as well. So with Libya, and it's something I go into the book more on the Libya case study because of these issues. You're absolutely right. A crisis map can give situational awareness to the UN and to factions, military, and so on, non-state armed groups. So I don't know how much of the story to tell, but interestingly enough, the UN wanted us to make this map public from the get-go. And it was we, tiny little digital volunteers, who said, no, are you absolutely crazy? We're not making this map public. That's ridiculous. We don't have a risk analysis. We don't have a risk mitigation strategies in place to make this data completely open. That's just not going to happen. And a few days later, they came back again. Are you sure you can't make this public? And we said, well, we'll do an internal analysis of the risks involved and how we might be able to mitigate them. And what we came back with later was, okay, potential compromise. We could make the map public, but we're going to put it on a 24-hour time delay, so it's not as real time. And we're going to remove any, we're going to remove the description of the reports. We're only going to keep the titles with no personal identifying information. So we basically redacted, we just censored the map, if you will, a lot of black ink everywhere, if you like, and made that public. And that's how we got around it. 24 hours, frankly, was arbitrary. We just said 24 hours. It could have been 48 hours and so on. Now, the good news is we didn't hear about anything the data being used for bad purposes, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. We don't know for a fact, which is why moving forward after Libya and then Pakistan and then Sudan, we made a decision that we would not deploy in conflict zones and not use crowdsourcing to work in conflict zones. So now what happens with the Digital Humanitarian Network and the individual members, when they get, for example, we got a request a few months ago from a UN agency to do some crisis mapping work in a highly volatile conflict area. And what we did there was we had some digital humanitarian veterans who've been around since the Haiti earthquake, who together as a small team carried out that particular digital humanitarian mission. And they were able to do that because now we have platforms like Ada where you can automate a lot of this. So it doesn't require 1,000 people necessarily to do this. So, but we haven't written about it, we haven't really spoken about it, and I don't think we ever will. It's just, this is stuff, it's too dangerous to mess around with. And by the way, I should also say that we follow the ICRC's data protection protocols as well. In fact, they added a chapter in 2013. They added a chapter just for us, digital humanitarians, to help guide us on how to manage crowdsourcing and social media and so on. So we follow these guidelines. And it's the same thing with the UAVs. We created that, a code of conduct on the use of UAVs, which now dozens and dozens of humanitarian organizations have contributed to, and we're hoping that USAID and DFID will endorse publicly next year. Great question. Sorry. I'll try and keep my answers shorter, but here, and then we're going to go that way. Okay.
I know you obviously rely on a lot of volunteers and a lot of partnerships to complete the program, but what's the kind of plan for sustainability from the funding standpoint?
That's a great question. So it's a good, so the different members of the Digital Humanitarian Network have different funding models. OpenStreetMap is pretty well funded. Standby Task Force is still largely volunteer-based. I think there's in-kind contribution from industry like Amazon Web Services providing some servers and so on, cloud computing and so on. But it's still, and I can't speak to all the other dozens and dozens of digital volunteer groups. It's a very cross-section of groups, but it's really a good question. I think a lot of this has been able to happen, quite frankly, because of the mandate that I was given at the Qatar Foundation, was to take advanced computing and apply it for social good. And given my background in the humanitarian space, I said, well, we need some help on the big data stuff. And so my time was, for all this stuff, was completely covered, right? And because of the mandate, we made our platforms free and open source. So it's going to take, I think, foundations to provide funding either for full-time people to do this, funding to make this, to develop these platforms, pro bono and so on. A lot of this would not, if the Qatar Foundation hadn't decided to do this and made a commitment, it wouldn't have happened.
And the people you work for, them being the clients, that's not a functional model.
Our clients are like UN OCHA, World Food Program, Unicef, but my time is free when I train them or when I meet with them to talk to them about micromappers and ADER and all this stuff. The platforms are free. And it's not just my time. I have a whole team. Goodness, this is, by the way, this is not a one-person show. And if you read my book, that'll be very, very clear, right? It is absolutely not a one-person show. I have a whole team at my disposal of really, really smart software engineers, software programmers, software scientists, and so on that have been dedicated over the past 3.5 years to doing this. I mean, it's not insubstantial. I should actually probably do the math at some point and find out just how much money ultimately the Qatar Foundation allocated to this. I mean, we're talking some serious amount of money to do this. So it's thanks to that. It would not be, so we need that kind of support. Yeah, it's a good question. Okay, 1 and 2.
I was wondering if you could go back to the code of conduct and the sort of issues that you tried to address with that code of conduct. I don't know, privacy.
Sure, yeah.
Whatever it is.
So, so we are now at the end of a year-long open consultative process with this code of conduct, where we've gotten literally hundreds of feedback from different organizations on how to strengthen the code of conduct. And when we first presented it at the UN last year, it was very well received. But they told us, this was all the large field-based UN agencies, said it's not enough. You need to have specific guidelines to support this code of conduct that are focused on key areas where there's a complete vacuum in terms of policy. And these guidelines were data ethics with respect to UAVs, community engagement, effective partnerships, So let's provide some guidelines now to at least inform people on what they should keep in mind. So there's a general code of conduct. It's all online. You go to uavleaders.org. Love your feedback very much. It's a Google Doc with a Google form to provide feedback. Does that answer your question? And I should say this code of conduct went a long, long way to us getting permission from the Civil Aviation Authority of Nepal to do our flights in Panga. They were very pleased to see that there was a community of practice that had developed these guidelines and these standards, and that was holding itself accountable. That helped a lot.
I had a quick question about the technology that the Edge network uses, and it reminded me of your example about the transition from 2D to 3D.
Yeah.
That reminded me of 360 videos that I've been exploring for the past year or two. And I remembered a 360 video called Welcome to Aleppo by Christian Stephen, which gave a tremendous amount of information in just about 3 or 4 minutes about the situation in Aleppo, the structural damage, damage reporting, stuff like that. So I was wondering how much 360, how efficient it would be to use in crisis situations, by the DH network. If you're thinking about
I mean, using 3D in conflict zones?
because of the amount of information it can provide.
That's a good question. I'm foolishly trying to write a second book, co-author this time. And what we're looking at is new technologies in human rights. And we're quite interested in this idea of using 3D for forensics analysis, trying to reconstruct a scene of a crime in terms of mass atrocities and so on, temporally over time. So we're talking with some Canadian forensics experts who are starting to use UAVs to uncover like mass graves and also to reconstruct certain scenes. And there's been some work done. I think they're called, the British group that specializes in this is using 3D and multimedia content to go after perpetrators of mass atrocities and reconstruct a shooting and say this bullet could have only come from that location and so on. I think 3D might have a role to play there. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure it out. You know what we did? We partnered with some colleagues earlier this year, a few months ago, and created the first 3D model ever of a refugee camp using UAVs. And we've approached the UN Refugee Agency and so on and said, hey, we don't know if this is useful. Could you tell us? And I didn't get a straight answer. They said at first, yeah, we could use this for camp management. I don't know what that means. I haven't really worked in the refugee space. So when I went back and said, well, what do you mean? I didn't get an answer. So I don't know if it's really, really useful yet. I'm curious, whether it's in conflict zones or informal settlements and so on, what role 3D could play. The only obvious role that I can see is if you're doing digital terrain models. And if there's flooding, what you can do is you can do risk analysis. If there's 2 inches of rain, which tents are going to get flooded or going to be underwater, which houses, which shacks, and so on. That IOM, the International Organization for Migration, has done that very well in Haiti, using UAVs and creating these 3D models for flood risk analysis. And the World Bank's doing the same thing in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. But otherwise, I'm not yet sure. I'd like to know what the research questions are. That's basically what I'm asking from our humanitarian colleagues, but I'm not getting it.
I teach intelligence here, and when I was listening to your work there, a number of questions came to mind. One of them is, so when you were, for example, when you're talking about using the crowdsourcing plus AI, and then you develop that picture, so how much value adding to that, I mean, that work, now that you've done it, creates a phenomenal, wealth of data. You were asked to, code houses in a particular way, but behind that, there's a whole set of questions, like which road could we get open fastest, or this or that. So is that data sort of turned over to the agency that asked for it, or do you do some of the value adding and take your expertise because you've been there before and turn over not only the base data but answers to questions that they have asked?
That's a great question as well. A bit of both. So GIS Corps is one of the members of the Digital Humanitarian Network, and they just are the pros at GIS analysis. So sometimes we'll take the resulting data and also have GIS Corps actually create information products out of this data, and then we share both. And other times it's just the resulting data. But frankly, Nepal was also quite clear that this second part is no longer useful as much because they don't have the time to then put it into information products. So the more we can better understand what information products the UN and the World Bank need, what they actually use themselves for decision making and so on. The more we can fit that particular template and hand that over as a finished product, there's a bit of a disconnect right now, and we need to do more of that.
So the question behind my question is, if you were dealing with the same folks every time, there'd be a learning that occurred. But if you have new players coming in, you're going to know what can be done with it better than they could in some cases. And I don't know how that works in the
It's
space.
just a few steps forward, a few steps back, a few steps forward. It's learning by doing a lot of
You're
this.
kind of developing protocols on that as you go.
Yeah. I mean, we do have, that's one of the advantages with the Digital Humanitarian Network is we have activation protocols and we have standard operating procedures on who does what, how, and so on. We've done a lot of work with UN OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. So we've gotten pretty good understanding as to what they need, what formats, when, how often the updates are necessary, and so on. But as we get activated by other groups around the world, which may continue to increase over time, yeah, we have a lot of learning to do. And that's part of the application process as well. I think we added a field now, is humanitarians who are activating the Digital Humanitarian Network need to add like what format, what's the output that they really need for their work. It's, I want to be careful to manage expectations. I presented here the good stuff, the stuff that works. Most of the stuff doesn't work. It's messy. It's a few steps forward, a few steps back. It's very iterative, and we're never coming out of a disaster where we feel like, oh, this was perfect, ever. Things break, Micromappers crashes. It's just a complete mess most of the time. But that's how it's been for the past 5 years, and there's, frankly, I don't think any other way to do it. We could lock ourselves up in a lab for 2 years and then think after 2 years that we've come up with the ultimate product. But the world has changed in the past 2 years, and it no longer is the world we saw 2 years ago. So the way that we're doing humanitarian technology and developing these platforms is iterative. We just throw ourselves in the water. We do it responsibly, ethically, following guidelines, following data protection protocols. But it's always messy, and our volunteers know this. I mean, we keep, with every deployment, we say, this may not work. You may get very frustrated. We're going to try it anyway because our humanitarian partners have said it's better than nothing. So this is all the nice PowerPointy, beautiful version, life is beautiful kind of thing. It's messy. It's messy. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering whether you collaborate with government agencies as of now, or you rely on humanitarian organizations to interact with the government agencies and lead the humanitarian work. And if you do not right now, do you plan to do that in future?
It's a good question. You in the Digital Humanitarian Network, we've never worked with governments, and we've never worked with militaries either. And the reason for that is our volunteers come from like 90 different countries around the world, and it could create some friction if we work with the US military or we work with the Filipino military. And so we want to stay out of the politics as much as possible and just work on delivering data that could potentially be useful in humanitarian settings. So that's not our role at all. It's a good question. Yes.
One is something you've already alluded to, which is sort of the role of capacity building, and so that you're not necessarily doing this for the rest of your life, and neither is the humanitarian network in some ways. And the second one is that you're generating a lot of data, and obviously this belongs perhaps to the organizations that you're doing this for, but are there plans, have there been pushes to sort of share that data? Because that's obviously amazing data that you're producing, and that could be used in different sectors or whatever else that might be. So I was wondering if that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So on the empowerment front is absolutely really, really key, which is also, by the way, why I lobbied strongly to go open source and free, because if we make it proprietary and a license base, it's going to basically crowd out other people. First responders, by definition, are the local communities. Always been true, will always be true, right? It's not the search and rescue team that flies in from Iceland 48 hours later. It's your neighbor that pulls you out of the rubble. And so what we want to do with these technologies as much as possible, not always possible, but is to share the technology, share the skill sets so that these first responders are equipped with this technology and can do what they do during disasters better. And that's very much the motivation behind the Nepal project. And it's not a one-off, by the way. What we've done, what the Nepal project is the first activity of Kathmandu Flying Labs, which is an innovation lab that we've set up with Kathmandu University and Kathmandu Living Labs to help create that first generation of Nepali UAV pilots. And this sounds really ambitious, and it is, but we're just trying to start off a small industry, a small UAV industry, because some of these engineering students, they get it. They see that they could actually get a job and make money out of this. And that's what we want. We want that excitement. We want these entrepreneurial students to realize that, hey, they could collect aerial imagery for government, for urban planning, for agriculture, for the international humanitarian community, and so on. And when disasters hit, they're going to be the first ones on the scene, right? And flying first. And they already have the relationship with the government, with the CAA, and it's not some cowboys flying in from San Francisco, Silicon Valley, with UAVs, and they've never been in disaster zones, which, by the way, absolutely happened, and got arrested and all kinds of stuff. So, yeah, we don't want that. We want local communities collecting their own data. And this has happened in Haiti, with IOM. In 2012, they trained local Haitians to use UAVs. And it's now this Haitian team that collects imagery after hurricanes and so on, and this Haitian team that provides the imagery to the government and to the international humanitarian community. That's how it should be, and that's what the model we want to replicate. So we're hoping to also set up Jakarta Flying Labs and Monrovia Flying Labs next year to build those local capacity. The second question was really important, and I don't remember it.
Oh, it was about data sharing.
Yeah, so we share that data with our humanitarian partners. The public data, as you might have seen, is only markers. You don't see a Twitter handle, you don't see the tweet itself, and that's following the ICRC's data protection protocols. We've had interest from students and researchers for this data, and we share that on a case-by-case basis, which may not be the smartest thing right now. But for example, the University of Sheffield have a social media lab or some visual media lab, and they're interested in doing some analysis of doing some quality analysis, control of the data. Was it actually georeferenced correctly? Was it actually tagged correctly? Frankly, we haven't actually done any of that. And so I'm really, really keen on sharing this data and imagery with responsible students and researchers to help us improve what we do and help us figure out what we're doing well and what we're not doing well. Going back there.
Two questions actually. This technology, when thinking about disaster response and also conflict zones, it seems to me, how much have you guys looked into using it to track the rebuilding effort afterwards? No. And I know you say you don't work with governments, but if the government is responsible, blah, 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 it seems to me like it would be a really good way, one, for them to monitor contractors and agencies, but also as a way to be transparent in terms of, especially in governments where corruption is an issue, where if it's public, then the communities can see, it's a way to bring accountability and transparency. Communities can see priorities and what's actually getting done. So I'm wondering if that's
a really good question. There's been more of that done in the ICT for development space, and I've not been directly involved as much, but I know the World Bank and USAID and others are looking, using mobile technology and so on to do, it's like M&E, like monitoring and evaluation, right? And I've had some initial conversations now with USAID. By the way, USAID has just funded 3 grantees to use UAVs as part of their projects. So it's also not science fiction, it's happening now. And yeah, we're talking about, with the Gates Foundation as well, sort of how do you use aerial imagery for monitoring and evaluation. And what you can do, and what's already happening in industry, is because these UAVs are programmed, you can fly the same, UAVs are programmed, you can fly the same flight every 2 days over the same area and show change over time. And that's what's happening in industry and for construction and so on. And so you could use the same idea with UAVs as well. So I think it's just a matter of time until that happens. Interestingly, we spent one afternoon in Nepal at a regional hospital talking with physicians and doctors about UAVs and asking them, could it potentially help your work? And they were very, very excited. And so we ended up actually creating a full 2D and 3D model of this regional hospital. And their main use of it was to share those pictures, because they were constructing new wards of the hospital, was to document that and show that to their donors, that there's progress happening, right? So it was almost a marketing, donor reporting kind of process, which I hadn't thought of before. So that was interesting. Yeah, we'll take 1 or 2, and then I'm going to have to run.
So I was thinking, what is the range of these? Because we talked a lot about using UAVs in Afghanistan to try to monitor, especially as we brought down our field presence. So I was wondering, what's the range of a non-military UAV? Is it possible to get it, if you have to be, say, in Kabul to be able to, or how, I
guess how difficult is it to maintain the technology? Could you like kind of fund them out to local, people and then?
Yeah, absolutely. So it depends how much money you have. One of the projects we're doing with this idea of Jakarta Flying Labs is there's thousands of UAV pilots in Jakarta alone. And what we want to do is crowdsource UAV flights. We want to take Jakarta, which by the way is 10 million people, and they get hit by monsoon flooding, dramatic every year. Half the population is under sea level, and it's just crazy impact. So what we want to do is slice up Jakarta into a grid and have each pilot adopt one grid. And then she or he is responsible for flying that grid when the floods happen. And then we take all the data and stitch it together and doing all kinds of stuff. So that's one way to get over the limited range, limited flight time of these technologies. But to answer your question, a Phantom 3 can be airborne for about 25 minutes. And they tell you, a range of 1 mile to 2 miles. And by the way, you can cover a lot in 25 minutes. It's just straight autonomous flights. But it can go, I've seen it pushed as far as 7 miles, 7, 8 miles out. And what you have is, by the way, you have your tablet or your smartphone that shows you exactly what the UAV is seeing and where on the map the UAV is. So you actually are piloting not by looking at the UAV, but just looking at the screen. And that allows you to go a lot further. That costs $1,000, $1,300, $1,300, $1,200, and it's going to keep going down. If you want to go a bit more distance, you're looking at fixed-wing UAVs. So a platform like the EBEE, produced by SenseFly, a Swiss company, is about 600, 700 grams, and flies for about 40 minutes and can cover about 10 square kilometers at 10 centimeter resolution in 40 minutes. And that costs about $16,000. Fully autonomous. Personally, I've flown it many times. It's a phenomenal platform. If you want to go higher end, there's Del Air Tech in France, and they've got autonomy of about 3 hours and can do 50 kilometers squared in about 3 hours. And then you can go up and up and up to, there's a Dan office is coming out with a UAV that's going to have 8 hours autonomy. So gets more and more sophisticated. And then you have the Predator drones, but we're going to leave those aside. I can take one more question if there is, otherwise, maybe behind, because we haven't heard. Tell me.
I just had a question regarding redundancy of effort. So, when importing image data and producing shape files and ArcGIS and that whole effort is sort of a cumbersome process. It takes a long time. Yeah. And with regards to that, even with a room full of people with a lot of training, you end up with a significant amount of redundancy in who's done what and how much has been produced. But when you crowdsource it out like that, is that less of an issue because you've got enough people? It's okay if people are marking the same things, the same metadata is produced?
Yes and no. I mean, not everything is crowdsourceable very easily at all, right? So for the more technical tasks, it has to be a small team of people who are going to work together and get this GIS map out of the door. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to find those tasks that can be microtasked and farm those out and distributed those out. And then the more difficult tasks have to be done, I guess, traditionally. Does that answer your question? Say again, sorry?
So that data brought in by crowdsourcing?
Yeah, basically, right. So, we'll collect all these tweets and then blah, 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 and have them on micromappers, on our micromaps. But then we'll share the data with GIS Core. They'll take that layer, they'll add other geodata to it, and they'll do their thing. And then we can also share that as an information product. So it is connected. And that's one of the advantages of having a digital humanitarian network is we know about each other now. There's so many different digital humanitarian groups. And so we can, in fact, what's happening more and more is we co-deploy. We deploy, Standby Task Force will deploy with Humanitarian OpenStreetMap or with Humanity Road. And so it's coalition of deployments rather than a one group deployment. Yeah, great question. All righty, thank you. This was a great conversation. Really appreciate it. Thanks again.